Thomas's first day in the classroom sends butterflies through his stomach. Standing before 30 pairs of curious eyes, he abandons his prepared lecture notes and instead pulls the antique musket from its protective case. History isn't trapped in books, he says, lifting the weapon carefully. It's in objects like this that were held by real hands during moments that changed everything. A collective gasp ripples through the room when he explains its provenance. His ancestor had stood alongside Massachusetts Minutemen at Lexington. One brave student asks to hold it, and Thomas nods, beginning a tradition that would define his teaching style, making history tangible. Before Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, Thomas continues, this continent had thriving civilizations with complex political systems. He projects a map showing Native American nations prior to European contact. The story of America begins thousands of years before Columbus. When discussing the harsh winter at Plymouth, Thomas unpacks a small cloth bag. Inside are parched corn kernels, identical to those Wampanoag people shared with starving colonists. He passes them around, asking students to hold history in their palms. Imagine surviving on just these, in a strange land, with half your family already dead from disease and exposure. The classroom grows quiet as the reality sinks in. The autumn chill creeps into the classroom as Thomas places a worn leather boot on his desk. Next to it, he sets a rusted railroad spike, a cotton bowl, and a tin-tight photograph of a stern-faced Union soldier. The decades between independence and Civil War transformed America from experiment to empire, Thomas begins. We expanded across a continent, but the question remained. Would we be a land of liberty for all, or just for some? He pulls down a massive map showing America's territorial growth, the Louisiana Purchase, Florida acquisition, Texas annexation, and Mexican cession. Students track the explosive westward movement, while Thomas reveals the human stories behind each expansion. For every line drawn on this map, he says, tracing the shifting boundaries, thousands of lives were appended. Native peoples displaced, Mexican landowners suddenly finding themselves in a foreign country, settlers seeking opportunity or escaping persecution. The class falls into a charged silence when Thomas transitions to discussing slavery's expansion. He distributes primary source readings, plantation ledgers calculating human beings as property, advertisements for slave auctions, and accounts from formerly enslaved people. History textbooks often treat slavery as a footnote to economic development, Thomas says, his voice tight with controlled emotion. But it was the central tension that nearly destroyed the nation. A student from rural Georgia raises his hand hesitantly. My ancestors fought for the Confederacy, he admits, voice barely audible. My family always said it was about states' rights, not slavery. Thomas nods, recognizing the moment's importance. Many families preserve that narrative. Let's examine what Confederate leaders themselves said. He projects Vice President Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech, declaring the Confederacy founded on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. The student shifts uncomfortably as Thomas continues. Many ordinary Confederate soldiers didn't own slaves. They fought for complex reasons, defending home, loyalty to state, economic pressures. But the leadership and wealthy planter class were explicit about preserving slavery as their cause. Rather than lecturing further, Thomas divides the class into research groups, each examining a different aspect of the era: industrialization in the North, plantation economy in the South, abolitionist movements, women's rights advocacy, and Native American removal policies. The presentations reveal a nation pulling in opposite directions, embracing democratic ideals while entrenching racial hierarchies, celebrating individualism while oppressing entire groups, pioneering technological advances while clinging to brutal labor systems. Maria's group presents on the Mexican-American War and subsequent border shifts. My great-great-grandparents didn't cross the border, she explains, showing her family's ancestral land grant. The border crossed them. As the bell signals the period's end, Thomas stands beside the classroom door. Next session, we'll cover the Civil War itself, not just as military campaigns, but as a revolutionary struggle that redefined American identity. That evening, Thomas receives an unexpected email from the Georgia student who had spent the afternoon in the university archives researching his family history. He discovered letters revealing that his ancestor, a poor farmer, had deserted the Confederate Army after Gettysburg, convinced the cause wasn't worth dying for. "I always thought history was just facts to memorize," the student wrote. "I never realized it could complicate the stories my family tells about itself." Thomas smiles at the screen. This is why he teaches, not to replace one simplistic narrative with another, but to cultivate the capacity for nuanced understanding. Tomorrow's lecture would be difficult, forcing students to confront America's bloodiest conflict, but he knows they're ready to move beyond comfortable myths toward the messy truth. 5 years later, Thomas Wilson stands in the university's grand reception hall, surrounded by familiar faces from that memorable American history class. The reunion event had begun as a casual suggestion in a group email chain, but evolved into something more significant when the university president learned of the students' unique historical preservation project. "I never expected to see all of you again like this," Thomas says, addressing the gathered alumni, "especially not with your work featured in the National Archives digital collection." Behind him, a large screen displays the expanded oral history archive that began with their semester projects. What started as 30 interviews with community elders had grown to over 300 documented stories, creating one of the most comprehensive grassroots historical collections in the country. Maria, now pursuing a PhD in Borderlands history, steps forward to explain how the project transformed her academic journey. "Professor Wilson taught us that history isn't just what happens to presidents and generals. It's the story of ordinary people making extraordinary choices under the pressure of their times." The quiet student from Myanmar, now working for an international human rights organization, describes how documenting American struggles for justice gave him tools to address challenges in his homeland. "I learned that no nation's path is linear. Progress comes with setbacks, and the work of creating a more perfect union never ends." As former students share how the class shaped their perspectives, Thomas notices the Georgia student whose Confederate ancestry had sparked such meaningful discussion. Now a public school teacher himself, he explains how he's adapted Thomas's approach. "I teach my high school students that loving your country means facing its contradictions honestly," he says. "Patriotism isn't about perfect heroes. It's about the courage to keep building something better from imperfect foundations." The university president announces the establishment of the Wilson Community History Fellowship, which will support students continuing the oral history project with underrepresented communities. Thomas, overwhelmed by this recognition, reflects on how far beyond the classroom his teaching has reached. After the formal presentations, Thomas walks with a small group to his old classroom, now equipped with newer technology, but essentially unchanged. On his old desk sits a sealed envelope, the 2050 predictions his students had written. "We should add new predictions," suggests a former student, now a climate scientist. "See how our perspectives have changed with time and experience." As they write new cards for a future they'll likely witness, Thomas thinks about how teaching history had never really been about the past. It was always about giving students the context to understand their present and the agency to shape their future. Later that evening, alone in his office, Thomas adds his own card to the new collection of predictions. He writes simply, "America will continue to be reinvented by those who take its founding promises more seriously than its founding limitations." He seals these new perspectives in an envelope alongside the original predictions, creating a time capsule connecting 3 generations of American experience. The elders his students interviewed, the students themselves now in mid-career, and the future Americans who would open these reflections in 2050. The greatest lesson of history, Thomas realizes, is that it never truly ends. Each conclusion simply becomes the prelude to the next chapter. The following week, Thomas arrives early to arrange 13 desks in a circle at the center of the classroom. As students file in, he hands each a card with a colony's name and key characteristics. Today, he announces, "We're holding a Continental Congress. You'll debate independence from your colony's perspective." The simulation begins awkwardly, but soon heats up. Georgia worries about British protection from Creek and Cherokee threats. Pennsylvania's Quakers question violence as a solution. Virginia's plantation interests clash with Massachusetts' commercial concerns. Remember, Thomas interjects, you're not just debating abstract ideas. Your livelihoods, families, and very lives hang in the balance of this decision. When a student representing New York points out that only white male property owners had a voice in this historic decision, Thomas nods appreciatively. Excellent point. Let's expand our Congress. He distributes new cards to previously silent students, an enslaved person, a woman tavern owner, a Native American leader, a loyalist merchant. The debate transforms, revealing the revolution's complexity beyond the sanitized version in high school textbooks. By the end, even students who normally stay silent are passionately arguing their positions. After a mock vote on independence, which narrowly passes, Thomas transitions to the Constitutional Convention. He projects an image of the original document alongside statistics. Of the 55 framers, 25 owned enslaved people. Half were college-educated when fewer than 1% of Americans attended college, and all were men of European descent. This document, Thomas says, tapping the screen, was revolutionary yet deeply flawed. It was both radical in its democratic aspirations and conservative in preserving certain power structures. When discussing the 3/5 compromise, the temperature in the room noticeably shifts. Thomas lets the discomfort breathe, knowing that historical understanding requires confronting uncomfortable truths. Maria raises her hand. If the Constitution was so flawed, why do we revere it so much? Thomas smiles at the perfect question. Because of this, he says, projecting the Bill of Rights. And because of this, he adds, showing amendments ending slavery, granting women's suffrage, and expanding civil rights. The founders' greatest wisdom wasn't in creating a perfect system, but a perfectible one. For homework, Thomas assigns each student an amendment to research, not just its passage, but the social movements that fought for it. The Constitution isn't just what the founders wrote, he explains. It's what generations of Americans fought to improve. As students pack up, the department chair slips into the back of the room, observing the animated conversations continuing even after class ends. She approaches Thomas afterward. I've never seen students this engaged in a constitutional history lecture, she admits. Most professors can barely keep them awake. Thomas collects the role-play cards, reflecting on the session. They need to see themselves in the story, not just as spectators, but participants. History didn't happen to distant figures. It happened to people just like them, making choices under pressure and uncertainty. That evening, reviewing student reflection papers from the previous week, Thomas notices a common theme: students expressing surprise at how relevant colonial-era debates about liberty, security, and governance remain today. One paper particularly strikes him, written by a quiet international student from Myanmar. I always thought American history was foreign to me. Today I realize that the questions your founders wrestled with are the same ones my country struggles with now. History isn't just about the past. It's about the questions that define humanity across time. For the final class session, Thomas transforms the lecture hall into a multimedia experience. When students enter, they're greeted by a timeline running the entire length of the room, spanning from Reconstruction to the present day. Their semester-long projects, interviews with community elders, are displayed as QR codes along the timeline, allowing everyone to access these oral histories with a smartphone scan. The America we recognize today, Thomas begins, was forged in the crucible of the last 150 years, from a war-torn agricultural society to a global superpower, from legal segregation to civil rights, from industrial revolution to digital transformation. Thomas clicks his remote, and the room fills with the crackling voice of Theodore Roosevelt giving a campaign speech. As the recording plays, Thomas projects photographs of teeming immigrant neighborhoods, massive factories, and labor strikes. The 20th century brought waves of change at unprecedented speed, Thomas continues. 2 world wars, a devastating depression, and Cold War tensions redefined not just our nation, but our very conception of government's role in citizens' lives. Rather than narrating the entire century himself, Thomas invites 5 students to present lightning lectures they've prepared on pivotal turning points: the Great Migration, the New Deal, the GI Bill, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Digital Revolution. An African-American student shares how her grandmother left Mississippi for Chicago during the Great Migration, carrying nothing but a suitcase and her church's blessing. She told me freedom came in degrees, the student explains. First legal freedom after the Civil War, then the freedom to move north, then the freedom to vote, and finally, the freedom to attend the same university as anyone else. As each student presents, Thomas observes how confidently they weave together major historical developments with personal narratives collected from their interview subjects. History has become something they participate in, not merely consume. When discussing America's global role after World War II, Thomas projects a split screen, one side showing the Marshall Plan rebuilding Europe, the other showing American-backed coups in Iran and Guatemala. American power has been wielded for both extraordinary good and terrible harm, he notes. Our history isn't a simple story of heroes and villains, but of a nation perpetually struggling with its ideals and interests. For the final hour, Thomas moderates a discussion about the most recent decades, events within students' own lifetimes. September 11th, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2008 financial crisis, cultural polarization, technological disruption, and protest movements from Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matter. History doesn't stop, Thomas reminds them. You're living it now, making choices that future historians will study. As the semester concludes, Thomas reveals the final element of their immersive timeline, a blank section labeled American Future. He distributes small cards and invites each student to write a brief prediction or hope for the nation's next chapter, pinning them to this unwritten portion of the timeline. The most profound lesson history teaches, Thomas says, surveying their thoughtful faces, is that nothing is inevitable. The American experiment continues because each generation chooses to continue it, however imperfectly. After the final students depart, Thomas walks slowly along the timeline, reading the prediction cards. They range from technological forecasts to social aspirations, political reforms to environmental concerns. Despite their diversity, a common thread emerges, a complex patriotism that acknowledges both America's failings and its capacity for renewal. Thomas carefully collects these cards, planning to seal them in an envelope marked to be opened in 2050. Perhaps some of these students will return for that opening, bringing their children to witness how history unfolds, not as a fixed narrative, but as an ongoing conversation between past and future.